So, guys, thanks for joining me today. I am going to go over this and go over this and go over this form over and over again because it seems to be coming up on just about every transaction we're seeing now. This is the broker compensation agreement exhibit. This is an exhibit that you would add to your contract, right, to show what you're going to get paid for a commission and who's going to pay it. That's basically what this form is for, right? I want to point out, we are getting pushback from lots of agents and brokers saying this form has to be signed by all parties. It does not. Not if you don't agree with it. So we'll start at the very top. This agreement should not be used. So it tells you, the very first line, it should not be used if the broker's compensation and the party or broker paying it have already agreed to in a separate written agreement and it is not being modified. Right? So if you have your buyer brokerage agreement, it spells out what you're getting paid and who you're getting paid by. You have your listing agreement that spells out who you're getting paid by and how. Obviously, the listing agreement, you get paid by the seller, right? So the seller's paying you. On the buy side of the transaction, you don't necessarily know as a listing agent whether the buyer is requesting that their agent be compensated by you, the listing broker, or if they want the seller to pay you directly, right? So on the buy side of the transaction, you will likely see this a lot. I'm not advocating that any of you use it, right? But you could start seeing this. Again, this whole thing may change at some point. My whole talking point on this, right? But compensation of buyer's broker, we'll just use 2%, right? And the compensation of buyer broker shall be paid by the seller, the listing broker, right? That's how that would be filled out. If you have a buyer agreement and it says that the buyer's going to pay you 3%, but the buyer allows the seller to pay you 3%, right? And it'll offset it. This compensation, you may receive an offer that says 3%. Make sure as the listing agent that that compensation matches what's in your listing agreement. If you don't and it's wrong, it's going to cost you. Okay? As you start going through all of these lines down here, any licensee signing this compensation on behalf of their broker warrants that they have full authority to sign, which you do at this point. I don't want to say you're not allowed to sign this, right? And then the next line, once this compensation agreement is signed, it cannot be further modified without the express written consent. So if you do something wrong in this, if it doesn't match your listing agreement and you end up having to pay extra, that'll be the last time that happens, right? It's kind of like the community association disclosure where we don't fill those out on behalf of sellers, right? Never fill it out. If they miss that initiation fee line, I just saw one, Steve Danino's, Sessions, that was a $2,000 initiation fee. Holy goodness. That's how much that could cost you, right? This, we're talking percentages of the sales price. So this would be even a bigger deal than that, in my opinion, right? So once it's signed, it cannot be further modified. The consent of the brokers whose compensation is set forth here, it controls now. This exhibit to the contract overrules your written agreements, your buyer brokerage, buyer authorization, listing agreement, whatever you have signed. This now becomes the controlling document over those.
But this is only for if I'm writing an offer.
If you're writing an offer.
It's not the other way around. So if I'm writing an offer, because I don't see when you use the second line. On the top line, you saw it said 2.5%, and then over, what did I say? What did we say? Being paid?
So the top line, who's the compensation of the buyer's broker? How much is it?
Okay, so
And who's paying it? That is really the only time this thing will be filled out.
seller is paying.
If the seller is paying, right? So compensation of broker is 3%. Compensation of buyer's broker shall be paid by, let's say it says the seller, right? and your listing agreement has the seller paying you 6% and you're sharing 3% with the listing broker. That's showing 9% to the seller. It's just going to cause confusion. Not to say it can't be your listing agreement with the seller couldn't be amended, but it just becomes a hot button issue, and why don't you know what's going on, right? So that's why pay attention to this form. Make sure it matches whatever agreement you have. To that end, if you have a listing agreement and your question, Shireen, this is presented by buyer's agents, right? And it's kind of them asking for the commission to be paid by the seller. You don't have to sign this if you don't agree with it. Everything else in the contract can be bound without this.
Do we have to have this amendment as a part of the contract?
No.
Okay,
So the question is, do you have to have this
it's not a required document.
this exhibit as a part of the contract? It is not required.
It's not required. So if you have your buyer broker agreement and it states what to be paid, and
If it states that the buyer is going to pay you 1%, but the seller is going to pay you 3%, and you get an offer that says the seller is going to pay you 3%, right? The seller is going to pay 3% to the buyer's broker, right? But the listing agreement doesn't say that the seller is going to pay 3%. The seller is only going to pay 2% to a buyer's agent. That's all they're willing to do. This is in conflict with your listing agreement, and this document will control. That's the point I want to make. If they sign it. So if the seller signs it, right? So as you scroll down, it is intended to amend it, shall be enforceable and binding. Like it is the controlling document. That's really the point I'm trying to make is don't let this get you caught up, right? Then it comes down to the compensation of seller's broker, and we're getting binding contracts where the top does match with the listing agreement. Everybody signed, it's a bound contract, right? And then the co-op agent comes back and says, well, you need to fill in the blanks down here, right? No, you don't. You're not trying to amend your agreement with the seller as the listing broker, right? Does that make sense?
okay, I'm gonna roll it back a bit.
Okay, roll it back.
First of all, so when we do instructions to closing attorney, that is not they're giving them a copy of this with that, or is that?
This exhibit is a part of the contract. If you look on page 8 of the contract where all the exhibits are listed, this exhibit name and number is specifically listed. So there are some exhibits there's a checkbox for other and then you write it in. No, this is like the third one down.
Okay, but because we don't have to use this, instructions for closing attorney would just be the instructions, our agreement with our buyer and the seller's agreement, whatever they agree to pay us, right?
Correct.
Nothing to do with the listing because we're not handling the listing. I'm asking as the buyer's agent now, right?
Okay?
Okay, so I don't need this, that required, my understandings are clear. When I go to, so if I want to do a showing, I want to know in advance, my buyer says, listen, I love you, you're fabulous, blah, 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 blah. However, I need to know what the seller is, so going to pay your commission.
That's the pre-showing.
Right, so that's the pre-showing. And
Yes.
they send that back to me. Does that become part of the contract?
No, that is not a part of the contract. That pre-showing authorization, that's going to be signed by the listing agent if you can get it back from a listing agent. I mean, our recommendation here as the listing agent is that we're providing it for buyers brokers just because this whole landscape is changing, right? So we're saying just provide it to the buyers to keep them from continually asking you and missing out. That does not become a part of this contract though. You could translate that you got in your pre-showing compensation to this form, and the listing broker should have no problem signing it, but the listing broker information does not need to be filled out if it's not amending their contract, right? Then that pre-showing authorization also, it obviously hasn't been tested yet, but getting that back should hold up in front of an arbitrator or a court
That's my question.
to confirm your commission, to say this is what they said.
What is it?
So if the seller or the listing agent sign this and it didn't match up with their listing agreement, the listing agreement said that they're only going to pay the buyer's broker 2%, but they're going to get 3%, right? But the buyer's broker says 3%. Your seller's going to have an argument. Hey, I agreed to 5 and splitting, and you were giving them 2. So you ethically now, because you signed this, you promoted it, need to give them 3. That's happened plenty of times in the past, where the listing information in the MLS, the percentage was wrong in there, where it's cost 0.5% for an agent.
Right, because we're going on what's in the listing agreement as to.
But now there are no more commissions in the listing agreement, right? So this is the commission in the contract, if you will.
And speaking of which, so we understand that at Century 21 agents, we're bound by the DOJ's.
At Century 21,
But-
oh,
right,
okay.
But if you're not part of that lawsuit, there's plenty of agents who are not part of that lawsuit, they can still put in the commission in the FMLS
FMLS is not going to have a percentage
for anyone.
for anyone.
Okay.
Correct. FMLS is going to have is your seller willing to pay
Something.
pay compensation to a buyer's broker? Yes or no?
Right.
Yes, no, or leave uncompleted. Our policy is that it will be left incomplete, right? You will have some agents who check yes or no, right? By default, I would say it's what? Nothing. I wouldn't make any assumptions. I would put the offer of compensation in my offer. Not necessarily with this broker compensation agreement, but with Special Step 620.
Right. I was gonna ask you, so if I do Special Step 620 and they sign it, yes, I'm gonna pay the buyer's agent, the seller's gonna pay the buyer's agent 3%. I don't need anything for coming after that, because it's part of the contract.
Correct.
Only the instructions to the closing attorney, am I right? So this is not.
You are correct.
Okay.
All right. This is confusing, and it's going to get a lot of people in trouble.
Hello, it just keeps
It-
shaking and shaking.
I like that. I like that. But I mean, this form is going to get somebody in trouble. You're going to end up paying extra, and that's why I keep coming back to this same form. Like, make sure this matches whatever listing agreement or buyer brokerage agreement you have says, if you're going to sign it. Just because you don't have to sign this to make it part of the binding contract.
You meaning the.
You the agent or the client or customer, do not have to sign this if they don't agree to it. And it doesn't change the binding aspect of the contract because it deals with the compensation.
And what you're getting people saying it should be executed.
It should be executed. It should be executed, and you, listing broker, should fill out this bottom section here. Right? And that's where the big problem is they keep coming back and saying, the compensation of seller's broker. Well, I'm not modifying my compensation anyway, so I'm not signing this. I'm not adding anything. I'm not changing anything. That's a hard stance. Could you fill it in? Yes, but if you fill it in incorrectly, you're just adding on extra layers of liability of issue.
And are you recommending as a listing agent for Century 21 that we do or do not fill it out?
Do or do not fill it out?
No, I'm saying.
Business.
What's your call?
I personally wouldn't. I'm not making a recommendation whether you do or don't. I'm just making you aware that this form could cost you lots of money. So make sure it matches whatever your agreement says. All right? I know you wanted me to say, you should all be using this form, or you should all, no, nobody should ever, no. It's all, yes. That is a good one. I use as few forms as possible as well. And Special Step 620 from the buyer's brokerage side handles the language needed to get the commission. And I will tell you, we actually added that to all of our pre-filled forms packages. And we've had 2 contracts in the last week where we've gotten 3% instead of the 2.5% advertised. You're one of them?
I'm one of them, yes. Yep, it was listed for 2.5 and I put 3% in the contract.
With
and
the
it came
6,
back.
you use Special Step 620 with the
It was already
3%?
typed there. I put my little 3 out.
Yep, because your buyer brokerage, your buyer brokerage agreement. That's all it is Special Step 620 put in there with the percentage that's left blank. That percentage,
No, because the seller of the home is also the listing agent. And she's a
So what if you
broker.
put 4%?
What if you put 4% in there? So in special 620, can you put 4% in there? Yes, you can, as long as you have a buyer brokerage agreement signed up front that says that you get paid 4%. It just becomes a negotiation.
Exactly.
This whole commission
That's why I
thing,
put
it's,
it in there for. I was
it,
like, let's negotiate.
it is now, commissions are becoming, all right, hang on with me. Commissions are becoming more and more transparent, right? Like, we want buyers and sellers to know what the cost of buying this home is to each of them, right? So, I mean, that's what it's doing. That's what special stip 620 does. That's what this does. But the language in this makes it to where you could get yourself in trouble, right?
That's why it's best just for us to use the forms that you guys created for us, right?
Yes.
It's already there, special
Yep.
stip. I don't need to do that when I'm
Right.
submitting
Yep.
offers, right?
Yep.
So why was this created, this form?
Why was this
I mean,
created?
what was happening that you go?
I would have to sit down and talk with Seth Weisman and the Forms Committee.
I have that class on Thursday.
Okay.
$30 worth every penny.
With who? Is it with Seth?
Is that-
Okay.
Yeah, I'm doing the.
Yep.
India change.
But sitting in his class isn't necessarily picking his brain on why this form was added. But if you can get an answer,
Forthcoming as-
yes, I know he is.
Yeah.
So, and that's why I was saying, if you get an answer, share it with me.
Yeah, please.
You know I will.
Yes,
You know I'll
yes,
follow up with you.
definitely. So be careful with the broker compensation agreement. That is the bottom line, right? And we will be Connect Wednesday tomorrow. Everybody will be here that's here. I hope that a whole bunch of you are as well. It'll be an open forum question and answer one-offs. We're gonna start diving into the minutia of it and how you can present these things to your buyer and or seller, depending on which side of the transaction you're on. All right? No Q&A today. Thanks a lot.